I did not know that.
Welcome to another episode of I Did Not Know That. Today, we're going to look at two guys who just happen to be nicknamed the King of Cool, Dean Martin and Steve McQueen. Don't miss a surprising bit of information at the end of this episode about Dean's real personality, and also what happened to Steve McQueen at the end of his life. It's something that you most likely never knew about. Next on I Did Not Know That. Throughout the years, certain music entertainers have gained royalty titles that stuck to them. Benny Goodman is the King of Swing. The King of Rock, of course, is Elvis Presley, and the Queen of Soul is Aretha Franklin. The King of Pop is Michael Jackson. For some reason, actors don't usually gain these royalty titles, but there is one title that stuck to not one but two entertainers, and that is the King of Cool. Those two were Dean Martin and Steve McQueen. Why do some guys have it and some guys don't? Ironically, Jerry Lewis, Dean Martin's old sidekick, picked up on the cool guy persona and even created a character called Buddy Love in The Nutty Professor. So, what is cool? Here are some of the actors that were admired for some of these characteristics. Some had all of these, others just had some. So, how did Martin and McQueen pick up the nickname? It appeared that Dean Martin picked up the title of the King of Cool first, and the person who gave him that title carried a lot of weight. It seems that back in the 1960s, both Elvis and Dean Martin were doing a movie at Paramount Studios. One day, Dean's daughter Dina stopped in to see her dad while he was filming, and they were standing outside her dad's dressing room. All of a sudden, Dina sees Elvis Presley riding up on his bicycle. It's fairly well known that Elvis was a big fan of Dean Martin and his singing style, so Elvis gets off his bike and comes over to see Dean. Dina Martin was in shock because Elvis was at the height of his popularity. Elvis says hi to Dean, and Dean introduces his daughter to Elvis Presley. Elvis leaned down to her and said, "Dina, they call me the King of Rock and Roll, but your dad is the King of Cool." Later, when Dean Martin knocked A Hard Day's Night off the top of the U.S. charts with Everybody Loves Somebody, Martin sent Elvis a telegram that read, "If you can't handle the Beatles, I'll do it for you, Pally." A few years later, in 1970, when Martin went to an Elvis concert in Las Vegas, Presley saw Dean in the audience and started singing Everybody Loves Somebody, which Martin found very funny. So now that we know how Dean Martin got the nickname the King of Cool, let's figure out why. Of course, most everyone knows that Martin became famous as half of the Martin and Lewis comedy team with Jerry Lewis. Lewis often described their act as the handsome man and his monkey. If you've ever seen clips of their act in its heyday, Lewis described it perfectly. Lewis would go absolutely crazy at times, but incredibly, Martin never seemed to lose his composure, look awkward, or embarrass himself. It's something that almost no one could have done. Ask Bing Crosby, who once ran off the stage and wouldn't come back on when he feared Jerry Lewis would pull off his toupee. While teamed with Lewis in films, Martin was also busy doing what he really loved to do, and that was singing. He had a top 10 hit with That's Amore in 1953, and then hit number 1 in 1955 with Memories Are Made of This. The team of Lewis and Martin split up in 1956, and many assume Martin would fade off into obscurity after the breakup. Lewis's wild and crazy antics often overshadowed Dean in their act, and therefore Martin's talent was greatly underestimated. After the breakup, Martin began seeking out serious acting roles. He hit it big in 1958 when he appeared with Montgomery Clift and Brando in the war drama The Young Lions. He also had another big hit with the song Volare. Over the next decade, he established himself as one of the top performers in film and music. He loved making westerns and appeared with John Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, Robert Mitchum, and appeared in Rat Pack films with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. He began to be known for his effortless charisma and always seemed unflappable. After Sean Connery made the spy genre popular, Hollywood looked for an American to duplicate the success, and they cast Martin in a series of films as super spy Matt Helm. They decided that the only way they could compete with the Bond films was to make it as a parody, which I think was a mistake. Bruce Lee choreographed some of Martin's fight scenes, and in a side note, Lee also trained McQueen, and they became friends, and was actually a pallbearer after Lee's untimely death. In the 1960s, Martin was a hot property, and NBC wanted him to host a weekly variety show. He had no interest in it since he was already doing films, appearing with the Rat Pack in Las Vegas, and of course, working on his singing career. He gave NBC an outrageous figure to do the show, and he assumed they'd turn him down. They didn't. The show cemented his persona as the cool and unshakable man about town. He'd sing his songs directly to the audience and had perfected the ability to make you believe he was singing just for you, and then he'd laugh at himself just when he appeared too serious. But the most incredible thing about that program was that there was something even more outrageous in his contract than the money he had asked for. Martin felt he performed better cold. He also hated giving up his golfing time. So he had written in his contract that he was required to appear on the set only during the taping of the show. What does that mean? It meant that regardless of the big stars that were appearing on his show that week, Martin was never there for any of the rehearsals. A stand-in would go over the lines with that week's guests. But oddly enough, it worked because Martin was so smooth that even when he'd come in cold and flub his lines, he'd make a joke about it, and the audience loved it. In this clip with Bob Newhart, Dean was reading off the cue cards, and it was cracking him up because the skit was all new to him. He was giggling and stumbling over his lines, and Newhart joked about it. You have to admit, you have to be pretty cool to be able to get away with messing up on national television and have people laugh and love you for it instead of getting angry.
Well, I liked a straight man who didn't laugh.
And Newhart even jokes about his old partner.
We'd have to have the price tag. You sure you worked with Jerry? Yeah. But our stuff wasn't this funny.
Well, let's move on to Steve McQueen. McQueen died in 1980, and try as I might, the earliest reference I can find to where he's called the King of Cool is a 1998 documentary about him with that title. If you can find a documented earlier reference, post it below. While he had bit parts in about a dozen films, the public first noticed McQueen in the classic horror film The Blob with Annetta Corso, better known as Helen Crump on The Andy Griffith Show. Despite being almost 30 at the time, he and Corso played teens fighting a strange alien life form. McQueen soon followed that up as the star of a TV series called Wanted, Dead or Alive. McQueen played a bounty hunter in the Old West who had a unique sawed-off rifle. While filming that series, he was offered the role as Vin Tanner in The Magnificent Seven. There's a scene in the film that probably jump-started McQueen's image as a cool customer.
We deal in lead, friend.
He and Yul Brynner volunteered to drive a casket to a cemetery while men with guns took shots at them along the way.
Second story window. Curtain moved.
I'm not in a good position. Let him stick his neck out.
A couple years later, he was in The Great Escape, and he played the Cooler King. Aside from the jumps over the barbed wire fences, he did a lot of the motorcycle riding himself, and those scenes are still talked about today. By the mid-1960s, he was considered one of the top action stars in the business, and he appeared in films like The Cincinnati Kid, Nevada Smith, and even was nominated for an Academy Award for The Sand Pebbles. In 1968, he starred in perhaps his most famous role in Bullitt. He played a tough cop battling corruption, and the chase scenes in the 1968 Mustang became legendary. Many of the roles he played were of a man who was sure of himself, didn't talk a lot, and let his actions speak louder than his words. So now you know about Martin and McQueen's careers as cool guys. Let's talk about who they really were. Dean Martin was raised in Steubenville, Ohio. His parents were Italian, and in fact, Dean didn't even speak English until he went to school, and he was teased because of it. His real name is Dino. He didn't like school much, and he finally quit because he thought he knew more than the teachers. At 16, he decided to try boxing. He had a record of 24-6 before deciding that he had enough of that. He was so broke at one point that he and a friend would charge people money to watch them fight until one of them was knocked out. He then worked in a casino, but it was operating illegally. But he always loved to sing, and it was said that he was singing often wherever he went. He attempted a singing career, and he began to sing in nightclubs. He changed his name to Dino Martini, and then later to Dean Martin to sound more American. He was having marginal success when he met Jerry Lewis.
One of the reasons Martin always appeared so laid back, cool, and relaxed was because that was actually a big part of his personality. He let Lewis do most of the work writing for their team because he preferred to be playing golf, but that created problems because Lewis was a control freak and started running almost everything. It all came to a head after a decade of working together. Martin was sick of appearing in what he called Jerry Lewis films, and Lewis threatened to find a new partner, so they split in 1956. Martin spent the next few decades developing the public persona of the fun-loving, hard-drinking party guy. He hung out with Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., and others, and they developed a Las Vegas show based on their relationships and reputations. In 1968, Martin finished filming his latest HELM film called The Wrecking Crew. At the end of the film, it's announced that the next HELM film would be The Ravagers. But one of the co-stars in The Wrecking Crew was Sharon Tate. Shortly after Martin finished that movie with her, she and her friends were murdered by the Manson family. It so disturbed Dean that he refused to make another HELM movie. The truth of who Dean Martin really was very different than his public image. He hated staying up late because the thing he loved most was getting up early and hitting the golf course. He once said that he'd much rather have been a pro golfer than an entertainer. His reputation as a big drinker was also greatly exaggerated, and he often had apple juice in his glass when he was on stage. He said in an interview years later that if he really drank as much as people thought, how would he be able to perform on stage year after year? He actually hated going to parties and would much rather stay home alone and watch a good Western. One of the great stories is, in fact, one night his wife was having a Hollywood party in their home, which he hated. He snuck into another room and actually called the police. He disguised his voice and complained that there was a noisy party going on at the Martin residence, and would the officers please come and break it up. The fact was that despite his charm and charisma, Dean Martin liked to keep to himself, and few people got to know him real well. Let's get back to Steve McQueen. McQueen had a very difficult childhood, and it affected him the rest of his life. His father was a circus stuntman and abandoned the family early. His mother was an alcoholic and then turned into a prostitute. He later had a stepfather who beat him and threw him down some stairs. McQueen was passed around to relatives until he ended up living with his Uncle Claude on a hog farm, and that was his first taste of a somewhat normal life. He loved his uncle, but at age 14 he ran away to join a circus. He began stealing, and his stepfather encouraged his mother to send him to the Boys Republic Reformatory in Chino, California. He said it was the best thing that ever happened to him. From there, he joined the Marines, where his love of engines was put to good use. He once said about his childhood, "When a kid didn't have any love when he was small, he begins to wonder if he's good enough. You know, if my mother didn't love me and I didn't have a father, I guess I'm not very good." He tried to find love in having countless affairs. One evening he was planning on going to a dinner party with a pal, but at the last moment he ran into a woman that he knew. He was married, but he decided to meet up with her instead of going to the party. The party was at Sharon Tate's house, and if he had attended, he would have been one of the Manson victims. And in fact, Manson had his name on a list of people he wanted killed. From that point on, McQueen always carried a gun with him. Because of his childhood, McQueen spent much of his life with a huge chip on his shoulder. He didn't like authority figures, and he had trouble working with almost every director in every film he made. Despite this, he became the highest paid actor in films for a while. It's interesting to note that at the point of his greatest fame, his interest in acting then began to fade. He all but disappeared from the headlines and spent much of his time racing motorcycles. He returned to acting in the late 1970s, but it was also when he began to have a persistent cough. He found out he had a large tumor, and he eventually died in 1980 at the age of 50. It may not seem like it, but there are drawbacks to being thought of as the king of cool. You're often pursued by some of the most beautiful women in the world, and if you're a married man, that's often a lethal combination. Both Martin and McQueen had trouble staying faithful to their wives, and I think it caused both of them a lot of pain and turmoil in their lives. Another problem with being a cool guy is, in that era, the ever-present cigarette in your mouth. Martin developed lung cancer, and while McQueen believed his exposure to asbestos in the military caused his cancer, I'm sure the heavy smoking didn't help matters.
Come to the cigarette with a thinking man's filter, the smoking man's taste. Viceroy.
But both men seem to have settled down at the tail end of their lives. Martin returned to his second wife, Jean, and McQueen married a woman who began sharing her faith with him. He developed a relationship with Billy Graham, and I think McQueen probably came to grips with some of the inner turmoil that tormented him much of his life. In 1980, Billy Graham met with Steve and gave him his own Bible. McQueen's last words to Graham were, "See you in heaven." McQueen died 4 days later, and they found this open Bible that he'd been reading on his chest. So now you have a glimpse into two guys who were crowned the king of cool. Did anything surprise you about them? I think it's often true that the public image of movie stars are often very different than who they are privately. Are there any modern day actors who you think might be called the king of cool? Bruce Willis, Denzel Washington? Post your comments below, and thanks for watching.